Hi, everyone. It's Andrew Klavan with this week's interview with Ruth Pakaluk, the author of Hannah's Children, The Women Quietly Define the Birth Dearth. I think this is probably the most important story in the world. The birth rate in America is near record lows, and this is a place where Elon Musk and I agree absolutely. This is endangers the continuation of humanity and certainly the continuation of our government and our form of government. It happened before the fall of the Roman Empire. The population of Rome just bottomed out. The city of Rome, I think, went from like 1 million people to something like 50,000 people. And of course, you can't have a city without people in it. It's just buildings. It doesn't mean a thing. And women in Rome went from having 12 children to, on average, to 2. And it's frightening to see this happening without anybody really talking about it, or anybody who is talking about it coming up with any ideas that have worked in the past. They're constantly saying we should give them a mom bonus, or we should give them this free thing or that free thing, and it simply does not do the trick. Catherine Pakaluk has written this book, Hannah's Children, The Women Quietly Define the Birth Dearth, which did something incredibly intelligent, which was to study those women who are still having children and find out what made them different from the women who aren't. Catherine, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. It's great to be here.
So tell me how this idea came to you. You are an economist, is that right?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so
I'm a bit of a, well, all right. Do you want me to go way back? So the idea came to me. It's really a sort of a funny idea, but a simple one. I mean, it's this kind of principle of immunity, sort of, there's been this constant concern, right, going back 200 or more years, going back to Malthus, but as you pointed out, go back to the Roman Empire. Mm-hmm. I mean, right, this constant concern about whether we'll have too many people, too few people. There's the doomsday thinking, which goes back. And as an economist, you come up cutting your teeth on this stuff. Why was Malthus wrong? And one of the things that we focus on as economists, that kind of mainstream economists focus on, is that Malthus kind of got food production wrong. He didn't anticipate or envision the kind of abundance that we've had and we've enjoyed. But of course, Malthus got something else deeply wrong, which was sort of how rational animals actually reproduce in very different ways from the animal kingdom. And this has typically been missed, right? So it's not just that we've had more prosperity, but actually that we're really not rabbits. And so coming up to fast forward, I thought, well, everybody's studying this population decline, right? And no one's kind of thinking more broadly about why people have children at all, right? Just like a really interesting question. Why do people have children at all? And so for the economist, it's kind of a normal move. It's sort of like, well, what's the sort of principle of human action involved? Is this, so then, kind of coming up to the beginning of the book, I thought, well, we could look around at the places where birth rates are falling. I mean, it's everywhere. Or we could kind of dig more deeply into the variation in different countries and ask, where are birth rates not falling? And so that was kind of the beginning of the idea, just study the outliers.
That's actually an inspired idea, because a lot of economists talk about the economy as if it were a bunch of numbers reacting to one another. But of course, it's got people in it. And so there has to be human motivation. Give us an idea where we are. How bad is this problem right now? How bad is the birth rate?
Well, it's very bad. It's very dire. If you care about, sort of things we've come to think of as basic parts of our life. I mean, the type of government that we have with kind of, a generous government, a government that, provides all kinds of benefits and things. And of course, what I largely mean is a social welfare state. I may not be the biggest fan of parts of the social welfare state, but if you care about those things, if you care about economic growth, it's very bad. All right, so where are we? Replacement fertility would be, on average, every woman has about 2 children. One for her partner. They replace the population. We have been, and so I'm going to take you back a little bit. This is what's being missed today. We have been among the native-born Americans at or below replacement birth rate, so below 2 since the 1970s.
Wow.
And so when I was following this as a college student and into the early 2000s, people used to say, well, American exceptionalism, we are doing better. We're not like those Japanese, poor Japan. They're never going to fix their problem. And Spain, we used to talk about, but actually we had this masked by immigration. So we didn't realize, or at least largely we didn't realize that. So we are right now at about 1.6 births per expected lifetime births per woman. If we were to zero in on the college educated women, women with postgraduate degrees, that number's a lot lower. It's down below 1.5. So the more education people get, kind of the worse that looks. And that was part of the reason for my book. So these are really low numbers. I've just read a paper that was published a couple of days ago, kind of asking what is the threshold point, beyond which populations can't recover, and there's a lot of debate about that. But it looks like somewhere around a little above 2 makes it very, very difficult for populations to really expect to go on. So we are really in that place where significant portions of our population will not have a future. Will not have a future.
Well, can you explain that? Why would you not be able to recover?
Yeah. So we're thinking about how many. If you make basic assumptions, which again those assumptions could be wrong, but you make basic assumptions about how many children each woman has, you could get to a point where there's so few women. And so few children are expected for her to have that even if some tiny group of people has a bunch of kids, you just can't. You can't get past it. No, it's not to say that some countries, some nations, and some peoples couldn't carry on. Of course, they could carry on, but the character of those peoples that continue will be profoundly different from the character of who they are today. Right?
Yeah. So, all right. So you did a study. Before we get to what you were studying, though, let me ask you one last thing. When the things that have been tried, the giving baby bonuses and maternity leave and all this, does this ever work? Has it ever worked anywhere?
Yeah. No, it really hasn't worked. I'll put a little bit of nuance on that. So first of all, we have at least 40 years of efforts to do this, and there's actually some really great historical examples too. So I say 40 years in the modern era of countries in Australia, Austria, lots and lots of examples. Parts of Canada have experimented with this, and usually they look like these kind of baby bonuses, sort of direct subsidies. I call these direct incentives to have children, and they don't seem to work at all. So in the last 40 years, we don't have any examples. Historically, there's a lot of really interesting commentaries. There are kings and monarchs and all kinds of examples from history of governments sort of trying to encourage a birth rate, right? Because of course the birth rate's essential for all kinds of things. And when we go back to pre-modern times, most populations are kind of on a razor's edge. They're not growing. They get a little ahead, and then the plague wipes them out. They kind of go back and forth. So there's not really sustained population growth. So people have tried many times. And one really interesting comment I found in my research for this book was a French economist in the 19th century said, sovereigns are not very effective when they try to encourage the birth rate, but they're terribly effective when they discourage it. So there's a terrible, asymmetry there. It's not that hard to discourage people who want to have children from having children. But if people don't want to have children, it turns out to be very difficult to offer them carrots to get them to do this.
So when you decide to go out and look for the women who are having children, how did you find them?
Yeah. Well, I followed sort of best practices for this kind of research, it's going to sound like really unexciting. I mean, you just kind of go around, you go to places where families are, and you post flyers. You say, "Hey, I'd like to talk to people with a bunch of kids." And so that's largely what we did. We picked about 10 cities around the country. We posted flyers with looking for people who, broadly married, have a college education, and have a bunch of kids, and consider their family size as purposeful. Like, we weren't looking for accidental births. Anyway, and then we solicited applications through a kind of QR code, and we had about 600 people apply to be interviewed. We could only interview less than 10% of that group, so we interviewed about 55 women. So that's what we did. It's, it's not glamorous. You just kind of, it's a brute force. You go out, and I suppose I should have used Instagram more, but I'm not. Next time around, I will make use of a research assistant who could use Instagram.
So starting with the general idea, what were your findings?
Yeah. So, let's make a contrast before I say what the general finding is. The contrast would be these baby bonus ideas. They kind of, they have something in mind, right? They have something in mind, which is that sort of people respond to incentives, and that there's some kind of cost benefit thing going on inside, the kind of calculus of how people think about having children. Now, I don't think that's crazy. I doubt that it's crazy, but of course, what we've seen is that at least these little bonuses, they don't do the trick. So what I was looking for was kind of like, am I going to find out that the people who have kids today, they kind of, they just have a lower cost of supplying children. Like, it's just easy for them to have kids. They're people who, are really well off, like the costs don't matter to them. So I could have found out that the story for these people was that it was just easier for them. They didn't mind being pregnant, right? Like the kinds of things people say. And I would put those in the bucket of sort of costs, right? Kind of different ways of sizing up the costs. Maybe, for instance, people who didn't care at all about work or about other things. It's like their favorite thing to do, right? Okay. On the other side, you could maybe find explanations that are kind of on the demand side, or the cost benefit side. The benefit side, like, what are the benefits? What do they think are what's essentially the value of having children? And so what I kind of went out and found, I heard a lot of things about costs, and we could get around to that, but I was overwhelmed, deluged with a story about value, about the value of children. So I thought, well, this is fascinating. This is not a group of people who say, I think careers are terrible. I've got like this trad wife mentality. I think it's evil to go out and work. I'm wearing skirts and hanging around it. Instead, there were a lot of variation in career interests and work engagement with work. But what I found out instead was that this is a group of people who said, this is the most important thing I can do. It's the most valuable thing.
That was their idea. This is it.
I was deluged with that. That was the common finding. They had different language for that. Most valuable thing I can do, most meaningful thing I can do. A great blessing for expression. Children are expressions of divine goodness. So anything I need to do to rearrange the other things that are valuable to me, I will do that. I will rearrange those things. So to sum it up, I would say the main central finding was that the story of people having kids today against this trend is a story of people who see tremendous value in children.
You remember the internet's original promise in the 90s, a digital world of equals free from government and corporate control. Today, that vision feels distant. Big tech and advertisers dominate our devices, with companies like Facebook filtering what you see and potentially influencing your vote. The internet was meant to give you control and freedom to explore. You want to reclaim that freedom? That's where ExpressVPN comes in. Every time you go online, your internet service provider tracks and records your activity, creating a detailed profile that data brokers sell to advertisers and government agencies. This constant surveillance means we're being watched and manipulated online without our consent. With ExpressVPN, all your internet traffic travels through secure, encrypted servers, preventing anyone, even your provider, from monitoring what you do. It also hides your IP address, the unique identifier that companies use to track and target you online. ExpressVPN gives you the freedom to browse without Big Brother looking over your shoulder, and it's incredibly easy to use. Just one click protects all your devices, from laptops to smart TVs. That's where I use it, on all my devices, because it's just so easy and it keeps my data safe. Right now, you can get up to 4 months free if you go to expressvpn.com/Klavan. That's expressvpn.com/Klavan for an extra 4 months free. But how do you spell VPN? It's KLAVAN. No E's in Klavan.
And have essentially organized their lives, like on purpose. They rearranged things. They picked how to spend their time. In many cases, they picked cheaper houses, or they picked lifestyles accordingly. They rearranged their lives to welcome children. So it's really a demand story or a value story and not a low-cost story.
That is really interesting. So, and was that, did you interview the husbands as well, or just the women?
Great question. I didn't.
Okay.
And that is the next project.
Okay.
That is, your question is the single most asked question I've had in the time I've been talking about this book. And I didn't, for just research reasons. I mean, you're kind of going out, you're thinking, well, I've got to keep some variables constant here. And basically, we've got this really interesting story in the 20th century of the women's movement. I mean, at least the second wave feminism, women's movement. How does that interact with this question? Like what people want, what women want. So I did write one chapter where I said all the things I could say about the men in my study. I learned a few things along the way. But absolutely, I mean, before we finished the first month of interviews, we looked at each other and said, we have got to come back and interview the dads. So that is next up. I am beginning that now.
So we're talking to Catherine Ruth Pakaluk. Hannah's Children is the book. Hannah's Children, the women quietly define the birth dearth. Just briefly, Hannah, I should have looked her up. She's in the Bible. She's the mother of one of the prophets, right?
Yeah, she's the mother of Samuel.
Okay.
That's right.
And why did you pick her as?
Well, I picked her for a couple of reasons. I was looking for kind of an archetype. So we're thinking like, well, so first of all, as you know, this, I tried to tell this story in a narrative fashion. I'm a very strong believer that story and narrative communicates meaning more deeply and more effectively than lists of numbers and statistics. So I don't think you have to be less faithful to the data, but so I thought, well, what's an image that's available to us culturally of really intense desire for children? And I thought, well, who's that lady who's that lady who wanted a kid so desperately?
That's right.
And that was Hannah.
Okay.
Yeah.
She
in fact, she wanted a kid
temple.
so desperately, and then got Samuel in this kind of miraculous way. That actually I'm not a biblical exegete, and I don't know a lot about classical languages, but most dictionaries will render the name Hannah as being blessed by God with a child.
Okay.
So I use her as an archetype to explain the women who are having kids share something deeply in common with that Hannah.
So what was it? What was it that gave them this sense of a child's value? I mean, I think that would be the big question, right? Yeah.
Right. So I'm here to say this isn't a representative sample, but 98% of the people I interviewed, it was what we call a biblical heritage. It was sort of an Abrahamic tradition. It was a very specific set of we could certainly say kind of biblical beliefs. I wouldn't say that was the only thing, and we can get to a couple of other pieces of this too. But the central, most important thing was a kind of package of maybe three things that are easy to place firmly in that Abrahamic tradition. First is that children are blessings from God, and the way they often put it is something divine, expressions of divine goodness. And the second thing is that children are the purpose of their marriages. Right. So there was a very a fairly strong claim that these marriages are about children.
Yeah. One of the stories that I did read was at the very beginning of the book. There's a story of a woman on a train who has 6 children.
Yes.
Can you tell it? I found that story incredibly moving, and I'm not even sure why, but can you tell that story?
Yes. So that was my story, and it's actually the story which first got me thinking about writing this book, and so it's why I tell it right at the beginning. It was a fascinating moment. I was riding home from a conference. I had flown into Washington D.C. and I got on a commuter train. I'd just had my 6th baby a few months ago, and I was coming home on a commuter train. So it's mostly people from work, but me with this baby. I've got this baby tucked into a a thing, like a package, we carry the baby around, just the head is sticking out. Just like you, actually, kind of a baldish head is sticking out.
Yeah. A lot of people say that, yeah.
Just enough peach fuzz that people want to reach out and kind of, I don't know if that happens to you, but people want to rub that head. This is why women
take care of me all the time, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so I sat on this train, I kind of squeezed in there, it's like 6:00, and there's people coming out of work, and they're not, mostly people with babies aren't on the train, and this lady next to me kind of looks over and says, well, like, is it your first? I don't know why people ask that question. And I kind of looked at her. You're having this battle with yourself. You're saying, like, do I just nod my head and say, yeah, just avoid? And I said, no, this is my sixth. And then there was this gap, because it's a closely packed train, so everybody heard this exchange, and a bunch of people said, oh, like, oh, sixth. And she just looked right back at me. She said, wow, I guess your husband still wants you.
Wow. That really got me. Yeah.
It got me.
Yeah.
And I thought, what is going on with that? But that's that question of desire, right? It's the question of what brings us together.
Yeah.
How marriage is doing in our society. How bound to each other people feel. How disillusioned they feel by the loss of desire for each other, the loss of commitment. I mean, it's like a lot's bound up in there. And of course, I just asked myself the question, gosh, like, to what extent are children part of that package of how marriage is doing?
And did you find the women that you interviewed, did you find them talking about that, about their marriage relationship in regards to the children?
Yes. And in fact, I probed for that. I asked them, I pulled headlines from places like Vox, because you see these articles like every 3 months, like, first she got married, and then, and it was great. And then the kid came and her marriage was ruined, or like having kids will ruin your sex life. You see these things all the time. So I brought these headlines, and I said, look, people say this, and what's your experience? Is the romance over? Is that anyway? This isn't dispositive, right? But if the narrative is kind of like kids are in a sense, there's your marriage and then there's your kids. Like, marriage quality is over here, it's a box over here. We're not really sure what keeps the spark alive. You might need to spice things up. You might need some. We're not really sure, but do what you need to do. And then there's your kids over here, and you kind of like animals in a cage, maybe. Like, you can't have too many of them, right? Because it might just threaten this other recreational thing that you do. And so what I really heard was something very deeply different. Things like, no, actually, our kids bring us together. It's like a mission. We go on a mission together, or we've grown because we're each growing up, raising our kids, and so now, like, I see my husband as an even better man. So there's more to love, this kind of thing. So, this isn't to say that all marriages with several children will be perfect. But this is a really different story from that one that you see in these kind of mainstream narratives that are skeptical about the value of children. So I did include, lots of those chapters have some pretty heartwarming stories about both the quality of the marriages going forward after lots of kids, and also just some great quotes. I mean, this one lady said something like, when you have a lot of kids with a man, he either becomes a jerk or a rock star. she said, luckily for me, it went the rock star direction, so really great.
I was at Cornell speaking, and a young woman, after my speech, a young woman came into the room, hadn't been at the speech, and just ran up to me, and I did a show with some horrifying title like "Bang Your Wife and Save the Country," and she said, "Do you still believe that?" I said, "I believe it twice as much because I think it's really important." And she looked so relieved that I didn't get a chance to ask her what her story was, but it actually obviously had moved her.
That's really great.
So, what you keep saying, this is not a representative sample. In which way is it not a representative sample?
Yeah. So, what I mean is, because of I'm still, I guess I'd say I'm still sensitive to the cancel culture world that we are hopefully coming out of, which is don't say your stuff does more than it does. Here's what I mean. I interviewed 55 women who are perhaps not representative of all women with lots of children. Right. So to do that, I would need to do kind of a plausibly random sampling of all the women in the country with 5 or more children. If anybody wants to donate to that cause, I would love to do that project, right? But what you do is you head out. Now, I don't think this is a big problem. In other words, like, a question you could ask me, which people have asked me, is, like, how representative do you think your sample is? Like, how, so I think it's pretty good, in the following sense. Like, I don't think there are, hidden pockets of people with 5 or 6 kids out there, that are just, like totally motivated by completely different things. I do think, there's a minority group, probably. I mean, if I'm just guessing here, I would say, maybe 5 to 10% of people with families that have kind of that are secular, but maybe kind of deeply humanist reasons for forming families and having families. In fact, many of them have reached out to me since the book was written, and I'm hoping to interview some of them going forward. But I do think my sample, in terms of religious commitment and kind of the value of children, I think it's fairly representative of in that sense. But I don't have evidence of that.
So one of the drums I bang all the time is the disrespect, I think, for motherhood, which seems to me to be the center of the universe. I mean, it seems like motherhood is basically the core function of human life. And if you're living in it's so easy to say, well, here's $5,000 to have a baby. Right. You can say that. I can count the money out. I know where it goes. And the fact that it doesn't work is just a sort of a bad side effect. But at least as a politician, I can say I'm doing this thing. Yeah. How then do you restore the idea that this is a thing of insane value? I mean, I see women have babies and come back to work like the next week, and I once actually bumped into a woman I know who had done that and blurted out, "What are you doing here?" And she burst into tears. And I thought, well, maybe there's no way to do this anymore. What would you say? Do you have a kind of a program that would maybe restore our respect and even reverence for this role?
That's a great question. First of all, I really want to affirm what you said. I think a lot of women in that moment are deeply conflicted and wounded by that process, or wounded by the feeling that they're trapped. Oftentimes, couples without foresight or without good advice, they make financial commitments that require them to plan to go back to work immediately, before they know how they'll feel about separating from that baby. Yeah. And that's a great, great tragedy. Something that I've repeated frequently is that if your experience of motherhood is one in which you give birth to this divine being that you really want to worship, in a sense, I mean, that's how much you've never loved anything as much as this baby. And then, within the next few months, you have to really detach emotionally on some level from the daily constant care of that human being. That's not a process you'd like to do many times, right? So I do think this almost like unsticking the Band-Aid that we need to do if we want to sustain that kind of going back and forth to work. I think that's terribly unpleasant, which is why I think we can see that things like more generous maternity leave or paternity leave packages, I think they're good. I think they're good to have, and people should be encouraged to take those things. But I don't think they're going to make people have more kids than they're having now, because that's just really unpleasant. I mean, that process is profoundly unpleasant. What about the culture of extolling motherhood? So I think this is a fascinating question. I think this has to do with values, and what I've seen in the traveling that I did is that the moms I interviewed are deeply aware that they're not valued, like in the meta culture. That what they stand for, that what they do looks a little bit like the death of a lot of the things that people deeply value. Your youthful figure, for instance. I mean, look at the celebrities that are like buying their babies through surrogates, so they don't have to get pregnant. But like specifically, they're not infertile. They're doing it because they don't want to be pregnant. Yeah. And so there's that piece, right? It looks like, so they're deeply aware that they're not valued in the meta culture. However, one of the pieces that was clear to me of what makes this possible for some women in local small communities is that they are deeply valued in their church communities, in their local communities. And it really I think I don't have an easy answer about the broader culture, but I do think that's something that is deeply American and was deeply American, which was sort of like, we didn't look to have the meaning of everything settled at a national level. We may have thought that that was out of reach, but that our local communities could do a lot of that for us. And so, this is where one of the takeaways for me has been kind of scratch my head a little bit and think like, well, how are we encouraging and treating? Are we able to? I don't know. Are we able to support and encourage the strengthening, the deepening of these? We could call them communities of meaning and purpose. I mean, we don't get meaning and purpose like from YouTube or from, but these are places where people do this, right? So they're church. I mean, largely these are church communities. A lot of times, like where I live, the church community is spilled over into a neighborhood, a very intentional neighborhood where people walk to each other's homes. So how do we make it more easy for people to find communities like that, build a life in communities like that? Because within that community, you don't need the whole world to love you. That you do need, well, let's see. Mark Zuckerberg tells us it's 3 friends. You do need to have 3 friends who tell you that you're doing a great job. Yeah. So
interesting.
On that front, I'm optimistic. Actually, I'm very optimistic that, as Spencer's written about and Ross is writing about these days, that in fact this hunger for the divine, this hunger for communities of purpose and meaning, is it's kind of coming back, or it's been rediscovered. That I'm optimistic that we're in an upward trajectory in that sense, and I think that family formation will come with it.
Interesting. Great.
Yeah.
Again, we're talking to Catherine Ruth Pakaluk. The book is Hannah's Children, The Women Quietly Defying the Birth Dearth. Catherine, if people only take away the fact that meaning doesn't come from YouTube, I think this will be a useful interview.
That's great.
It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and I hope you'll come back and talk again as you do more work. All right.
I'd love to do that. Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Andrew.
That was really interesting. Easier to give people money than to give them meaning, but meaning is there for the taking if you go out and get it. Catherine Ruth Pakaluk, Hannah's Children, The Women Quietly Defying the Birth Dearth, really sounds like a good book and a worthwhile study. Also worthwhile is the Andrew Klavan Show on Friday. I'll be there. I hope you will be there too, and I'll see you then.